This is My Taste is Better Than Yours, the manga podcast where Guardian Enzo and I, Samu, discuss some of our favourite series and figure out, is my taste better than yours? Hello once again, everyone, to My Taste is Better Than Yours. This is Samu speaking. I'm being the host for this episode, and I'm joined, as always, by Guardian Enzo from lovely Kyoto, Japan, which is quite relevant to the series in some ways, I think.
Yes.
How are you doing, Enzo?
I'm fine, thank you. Glad to be here. Talk about a very interesting series.
Yeah, this is one of my all-time favorite series we're going to be discussing. It's similar to Yugami, where I read that off of the back of Enzo's recommendation. I tasked him with covering Ooku, the Inner Chambers, which I will say off the top. Thank you, Enzo, for going into this. We did pick series that were roughly kind of similar volume count. It's 19 volumes in the end, but if you told me it was 19 novels, um, I think it would also be appropriate and it could cover the same amount of detail that this goes into here. So some key details off of that is this is by Fumi Yoshinaga. She is. I was going to say she's a famous shoujo mangaka, which she is, but she covers various different demographics and genres in her works. I mean, she has loads of BL titles, which are very popular. She maybe others will know her more recently for her Seinen series, What Did You Eat Yesterday, which I believe is quite popular in Japan because it had a live action TV series with two very popular actors playing the lead roles, which is basically about a domestic gay couple. One is more of an extravagant hairdresser type, and then the other, which is straight laced lawyer, throw in them handling their perceptions of the relationship in modern day Japan. It also being primarily a cooking series where so many of the chapters are framed around what they're eating and cooking for each other. It's, yeah, considering it's a Seinen title as well, she branches out in various ways and she has quite a deep fan base, I think, and she's very well respected in what she does. She also had Antique Bakery. That was another series that did get an anime, and was quite popular, I think, among those who are familiar with it. Ooku is technically a shoujo series. It did publish in Melody magazine, but from over the years of looking it up, there doesn't seem to be 100% consensus on whether this is technically shoujo or josei, because from what I understand, Melody maybe changed its demographic or changed its approach partway through. It then is putting itself out as a shoujo series for women. I don't know. There's a lot of elements to it. Whether it's shoujo or josei, it's a very mature series about, it is an alternative historical fantasy story, let's say, set during the Edo period in Japan, which focuses on the politics of primarily the Edo castle, led by the Tokugawa Shogunate, who were the military rulers of Japan from the 17th to 19th century. And the series itself covers a very long period of time. But the thing that makes it different from just being a straight up historical retelling is there is the major twist introduced right at the beginning that is the red face pox, which is a deadly sickness which kills the majority of Japanese men in society, resulting in basically women having to take the positions of power throughout the country. I think it's something like the male population goes down to one fourth of what it used to be. So all these various roles that were expected of men have now been flipped, and that is including the title Shogun itself, as well as the Ooku, who are in our world the women concubines within the harem of each shogun, within the Tokugawa Shogunate. So with that flip in society, we see how that affects everyone, men and women both, how they're treated and how they perceive each other, how they are perceived now in their new roles, and the luxuries that are taken from them or that they're afforded in this society that has changed from our own. I would argue that it succeeds in just so many ways, and how it tackles that. Some other maybe points to note as well are it takes direct inspiration from the namesakes of the male shogun and other principal historical figures that we know, and plays around with the history and the drama. And if you're someone who likes court politics, violence, tragedy, romance, love, death in their story, this has all of that in spades. Though I would also say that this basically comes with every content warning imaginable, I would think. It goes into some dark places and it doesn't shy away from them, but also I don't feel like it's exploitative in any way. It very much feels like its own version of retelling history with this twist. So yeah, that's the basic description of the series. I think I really love that this idea that it has of the cycle of life carrying through what is basically 200 years that pass between the beginning and the end of the series through all these rulers, all these shogun, all these characters. It's as epic as they come, in that sense, and the sheer like wealth of details that we could dive into. For Oooku in particular, it's a very acclaimed series as well, winning loads of awards. It was nominated for Manga Taisho in 2008, and it's a 3-time nominee for the Osamu Tezuka Cultural Prize, and it did win once as well. And there are various titles it has. It won the Shogakukan Manga Award in Shoujo, the twice winner of the Japanese Association of Feminist Science Fiction and Fantasy, near the start and end of the series it won. So I think those are all appropriate and very telling of the prestige that the series has. There's a lot of acclaim to it, and I love so much about it. But before we get into detail, Enzo, I feel like you knew Oooku because I would relentlessly talk about it at any opportunity I had for years. Now I've finally got you to read it, which I'm thrilled about. But what were your thoughts and feelings, discounting the anime that did come out, which we will talk about shortly?
Well, first of all, let me say that I would never in 1,000 years have said this is a shojo if you hadn't said that it had sometimes been categorized that way. It doesn't, to me, it doesn't read as a shojo manga. I would have said josei or even seinen, more than shojo, for whatever that's worth. I would also, honestly discount the anime. Really, I mean, the anime is fine. It covers a sliver. It's barely an appetizer of what the manga is. It's more like an amuse bouche. It's just a very very. It covers basically the first arc, and not even. I would not even argue the entire first arc. Um, but we did my first. Honestly, I first became aware of it when we did the which I mentioned in our Yugami Kun episode, but when we did the LIA video podcast a couple years ago, when we were each picking manga that we never thought that should have an anime that would never get one, and you picked Oku, and at the time I had never heard of it actually, or if I had heard of it, but I knew nothing about it really. So uh, yeah, I know about the series really now more because yes, I did watch and blog the anime, but also because it's one and Lord knows what a strange thing it is that it finally got an anime. I mean, it's really miraculous in a way, even if it was abbreviated. But also, so I went into it expecting something pretty serious, pretty epic, something pretty dark in a lot of ways. As you said, every content warning in the book, although I don't think it abuses any of them. I agree with you. And in some ways it met my expectations in that sense, and in some ways I would say it subverted them. There were definitely elements of it that surprised me more tonally than narratively, but yeah. I had, I knew how much you loved it, and I knew that the anime, I could tell the anime was not inspired in the way it was adapting, but I could also tell that it showed enough to say, okay, there's something interesting here. I'm interested in digging deeper. And as someone who does love Japanese history anyway, and history generally, I kind of had a little leg in the door that way anyway, because like I say, I do love history. So
Yeah, I feel like anyone who's familiar with the Tokugawa Shogunate, they'll be able to pick out a lot of elements here. Um, I think in the beginning, it's hard to tell maybe what direction the series is going to go. You mentioned the anime adaptation. I mean, that covers basically the first two arcs of the series of what is ultimately, I would say, 13 arcs. If you want to split up each one by all the various shogun that we cover, so we cover 13 of the 15 within the entire series, and that spans across 200 years, like I say. It's a tiny part of the series we've seen in the anime, and I think I agree with you. It was serviceable in some ways, and it was serviceable and straightforward without really bringing to life what I think makes the series for me so enjoyable. But yeah, to go into, as I said, it won the Japanese Association of Feminist Science Fiction and Fantasy Award twice. This is, I think, a deeply feminist series. I think Fumi Yoshinaga is tackling here with full intention, and the exploration of this idea of a gender flip society where women are in control. But then also, what I think is worth noting is it doesn't forget or doesn't use that in a way that makes all these women like girl bosses that are badass and epic and we should love them and isn't it so cool that they can do all this. I think what it does rather is it shows how it affects both the men and women in society across all these various storylines. It goes into different degrees, different elements that it changes their lives. Yeah, that's something that I got very early in the series as well, because the first arc is focused on Mizuno, who feels like almost like a false protagonist. I know I mentioned this before in a Akane Banashi, but this feels maybe even more appropriate because with that first volume, it almost feels like it could be a self-contained story in of itself before it unravels into this giant epic retelling of history with a twist. Um, One thing I wanted to ask you, Enzo, while we're still in the general discussion rather than specific points, is one thing I love about the series that I think it handles really effectively, that is really difficult to achieve, and so few series even try, is this is a narrative where I feel the characters are in service of the overall plot rather than the story being about the characters, if that makes sense. You know, there feels to me that like time itself is almost a character that goes through all of these characters that we see, and there's like this feeling of impermanence that carries through with each arc, with each storyline, where we get so engrossed into the details of each character and what dramas unfold from there before moving on as you kind of do in a history book, and you keep going, and sometimes some details are remembered and carry on, but also some characters forget things in the same way that you might forget things with the sheer amount of detail that is thrown your way. I think it's a hard balance to try and not make the characters feel disposable while also tackling something so grand in scope. I mean, I feel like so few anime manga cover a 200-year period with this detail. So yeah, can you think of any other that are less character driven stories like this, but are more about the overarching experience and how these pieces can be moved around and played around with?
if Heiki Monogatari had been an adaptation that was remotely faithful to the original story, that would have been a perfect example because uh, I know you've seen the anime. I don't think you've read the book, but Heiki Monogatari to me was a clear inspiration for this series. Not the anime. Don't go by the anime because the anime is nothing remotely like the original story. But the original story, as written, and in fact, it was not even originally a written story. It was an orally. It was the Biwa monks. It was a series of oral tales, spoken stories that were eventually compiled in written form. That to me is it doesn't cover quite 200 years, but it has something of the same sense of presenting a history, and the characters are in service to the overall story that it's trying to present. And I do feel like Oooku is really it's packaging itself as a work of history. It just so happens that the history, it's not doing the actual history, it's doing an alternative retelling of it, but it's doing an alternative retelling in the format of almost, almost a history book. So that would have been the most obvious example I can think of. And another example is the one I'm going to cite when we get to the recommendation section. No spoilers, but I think that one is more character driven than Ooku is. So no, off the top of my head, no. I'm sure if I had some time to grind on that, I could come up with another few examples of it. But no, it is pretty unique in that sense. It's almost like the decline and fall of the Roman Empire in a sense. Really, it is more like a multi-volume history chronicle than it is a traditional narrative fiction.
Yeah, chronicles, I think the perfect word. That's how I describe it as well. Um,
And of course, that word is
I
prominent.
think
There's an in-story thing that's a chronicle too, that plays a major role in the story, and I don't think that's coincidental.
yeah, like you say, that's a pretty prominent part of the story, and I want to get into some specifics and spoiler details, but before we do, yeah, I would recommend it to anyone who just wants to experience something that feels grand and epic in a scope that I would say isn't really attempted much in manga at all. I mean, you have long running series that are epic. I would think something like Kingdom, which I'm nowhere near up to date, so I can't comment on how far through that is on depicting the characters, the real life versions of the characters. But that is still something that is so focused on a very specific, shorter period of time. Whereas Oku, I one of the things I just love, like I said, is after experiencing it, I just feel like I've experienced a giant chunk of history, and it's just like swept over me in the same way that the characters themselves, just like people in real life, aren't they're important for their own individual lives, but almost feel insignificant in the grand scheme of things. Which yeah, I love that approach. It's very refreshing, and how it tells its story. Um, I think before we get into spoilers, though, you do have. I think there's something maybe you can touch on, Enzo, that you, I believe, wrote a blog post on it a while ago about how it uses the imperial family for dramatic effect.
Yeah, I did. It's actually I did. It was a commission I did actually, but it ended up being something really interesting to me. So they have this thing in Japan called the Chrysanthemum Taboo, which basically dictates that the royal family, the imperial family, should not. I almost thought I was in the UK there. The imperial family should not be the subject of a narrative fiction. Their lives should not be fictionalized. They should not be characters. And while you sometimes see it with the when you go way back, like in the Heian period, like the 9th, 10th, 11th centuries, you sometimes see that. Like the Genji Monogatari prominently is an example of that, and Heiki Monogatari too, for that matter. But um, it very rarely in the Shogunate era or later, that's when it really applies. You don't see the imperial family very often as characters in fiction. It is a taboo. It's not a law. It's not written in law, but that's why they call it a taboo and not a law. So most of this series, we're gonna get into the spoilers, but I mean most of it is about the Tokugawa Shogunate, rather than the imperial family per se. And there's no Tokugawa taboo. I mean, you often seen the Oda Nobunaga and Hideyori, and then and all the Sengoku, all the warlords. So that's something that you see depicted a lot in fiction. But there does come a point in this story when the imperial family becomes characters of importance in the story, and that's unusual in Japanese fiction because of the chrysanthemum taboo. And it's not as if they're treated with kid gloves here. I mean, they're not treated as comic relief or anything, but they're treated just like the shogunate characters. They're treated as being real people with real feelings and real flaws and real they're warts and all human beings, and that's very, very unusual to see that in Japanese fiction because of the chrysanthemum taboo. So I did think that was notable.
Yeah. I know. Obviously, there's a lot of stories about the Tokugawa Shogunate, so like you say, that aspect isn't unexplored. But I did when I was thinking back on you doing that coverage, I thought that was interesting because I also can't think of off the top of my head stories about the imperial family. So yeah, this kind of goes in that other direction. I think it helps that it's using this gender flipped experimental like look on history and society that I don't know if get away with it is the right term, but it would feel strange if it completely ignored it well as well once it got to that part of the story. So yeah, with that then I suppose we can jump into more specific spoilerific mentions. So we'll highlight, like I said, there are so many Shogun and storylines to cover here. We'll just touch on maybe our favorites, ones that we felt were most prominent or deserving of discussion. Before I get into specific Shogun characters, though, I want to ask you, Enzo, was there a point partway through that it felt evident to you that maybe this wasn't all just alternative history with that twist at the beginning with the red face pox, but was leaning more and more into an actual depiction of history? Like, did there come a point where you thought, huh, this series is doing it, this feels so true to what happened in real life that it almost feels like it just is real life that they're depicting?
So just so I understand the context of the question, are you asking me if at ever point that it kind of blurred in my mind and it seemed like I was actually uh, reading the actual history as opposed to a fictionalized version of it, or was it like a suspension of
Exactly.
disbelief moment?
Yeah,
Um,
did it feel less like a fantastical retelling and more just like a straightforward
yeah.
historical retelling?
Um, Let me first of all say, to loop back to the question of other things that have that same kind of multi generational epic feel. It just struck me that the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, uh, which is of course originally a Chinese novel, but it was also later manga and anime, is one that definitely hits some of those same notes of being a character of being a story driven series where the characters are there in service of the story, but are still important in their own right, and is told over a long period of time. So that's just on that brief thought on that. Um, as far as the next question you asked me about the blurring the lines, I think it's more gradual. As you get deeper into the series, you become more. You start to think less and less about the fictionalized aspect of it, and you begin to recognize. I personally feel like it becomes less. Are we okay to talk about spoilers, or did we not officially get into that section yet?
Yeah, go
Would you
for
rather?
spoilers. Go on.
Okay. Because I feel like once the red face pox becomes less of a MacGuffin, it actually tracks much closer to history than before. I mean, just generally speaking, because for much of the series, the red face pox is really the fundamental plot driver, and at some point, it becomes no longer the fundamental plot driver. And it's very interesting the way that transition happens. I'm not saying it's just tossed off, but it's not that. But as an evolution of the story, it becomes less of a factor. And as it does, as the red faced fox, which is the ultimately what fictionalizes the story in the first place, it's what, in the Steins Gate sense, it's what kicks it off, into this other timeline. As it becomes less of a factor, the timeline that we're in starts to revert back to looking more like the real timeline. And as that happens, that's when it starts to feel more like you're reading an actual history and less like you're reading historical fantasy. So that would be my answer to that question.
Okay. Yeah, I'll look back on that again when we discuss the very, very ending. For before that, then though, we can. I suppose you mentioned the red face pox. That was overarching storyline, as you say, throughout first half of the series. We saw that occur throughout several shogun. Um, Thinking off the top of my head as well on some of my favorite characters, favorite moments in the series. uh, I feel like it would be hard pressed not to mention Yoshimune, who is maybe arguably the best ruler that we see in the series, which probably mirrors how he is referred to or how he is regarded in real life as well. At the time that Yoshimune in this story comes in, she makes so many changes within the society and the approach to the Ooku as well, and this forced austerity that she puts upon herself and her peers in the name of improving Japan as a ruler. She takes a big involvement in trying to find this cure as well, with the red face pox. And she has another. So I think in that respect, she was maybe the most effective ruler out of all of them. But like so many characters, there's shades to everyone that we see here. And maybe her detriment was how she treated her children and how she, um, we see that two of her daughters succeed her, and she makes the decision of putting her first daughter to be the shogun after her, who proves to be nothing like her mother, not successful in any way, and quite deceptive to the people around her, and cruel in a way that you see some other rulers being as well. I mean, yeah. What are your thoughts and feelings on Yoshimune as a character? And yeah, you've got that aspect of her children, and I should also mention one part before you answer. Another character, her assistant Hisamichi, who is one of my, I think, favorites in the entire series. She kind of has this reveal because she seems quite unassuming, quite kind, and she gives off that impression through her looks and her actions, I feel, for quite a lot of the series. But there is that big revelation that so much of what fell into place for Yoshimune was Hisamichi orchestrating it behind the scenes and causing tragic events for the family that um, made this unlikely person inherit this position of power. Um, so yeah, any thoughts and feelings on Yoshimune and everything that extended out from her role, her character?
Well, I think in the larger context of the story, she's probably the most important of the Shogun characters in many respects. And I think you often see her name referred to later in the story when the later generations people talk about how the Yoshimune was. That was like there's almost in the sense a BY and AY in the timeline before Yoshimune and after Yoshimune. It's like she's the benchmark of the whole long, centuries long span of the story, and everything that happens before her and everything that happens after her. And in real life, the real Yoshimune, as you say, is generally regarded as one of the better Tokugawa shoguns. He was the one who originally lifted the ban and allowed Western literature into Japan, which was a very, very important moment in Japanese history. A lot of financial reforms and such. I think, while there are exceptions within the story, I mean, my general working assumption with people in this position is that they're going to treat their family like shit, because that's just generally how it was, and I don't think she's any exception. And the situation with her daughters, the daughter she chose, as you said, you know, that was not an ideal situation by any stretch. But I think we also saw that the other daughter would, there were some reasons why she made the choice she did. Um, but most of the parents in this series are not real parents in any sense that we would think of the term, at least not among the Tokugawa and most of the elite class. So yeah, she's like I said, as she's not the most interesting of the characters in the series for me, but among the Shogun characters, I would say she's probably the most important of any of them.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm going to jump off of what you said on the before Yoshimune and after Yoshimune. So if to touch on any of the what I think are the more prominent storylines before Yoshimune, when we have this revelation of the pox and how it came to be. The second arc that was covered in the anime is of the third shogun, Iemitsu. That one's very much about that society struggling with this upcoming disease and understanding how they're going to handle what it means to maybe have a woman in power. You have Iemitsu, who's quite a tragic figure and struck with so many things that have happened in her life, and that's the storyline with her and Arikoto, which I really like. That's maybe one of my favorites of the series. I think the anime did not really give it full justice and how it depicted it. And as well, I like Lady Kasuga, who we have as the essentially the villain of that major storyline, which
Hmm.
she kind of represented this idea of a true conservative, but a conservative woman who was against the idea of women coming to positions of power, where you had this irony of eventually it's the counselors, all these male counselors around her who oppose her ideas and are finding it difficult to manage it. Um, Eventually, Iemitsu does get into power, and we see how it unfolds from there. I mean, her storyline is quite tragic. It's more of like a love story, I think, compared to anything else that comes after it. Yeah, I'm curious if you have any other thoughts, or if there are any other shogun in particular that, or characters from those storylines that still
Well,
resonate with you.
uh, I think from that original story with Iemitsu, I just think because, as you said, Arikoto is a character who has his shadow never leaves. His shadow is felt through the whole story. And it's even implied. I don't think it's ever meant to be literally implied, but it's sort of implied that he's even like reincarnated a couple of times. There's certainly people who seem to embody his symbolic presence later in the story. So I do think Arikoto is quite a memorable character too, as is Gyokuei actually. Because as you said, we kind of follow him through his whole life, and it's quite a life it is too. I really did like the Iemitsu character. I found her to be tragic in an endearing way. And she, to me, of all the Shogun characters, I think she evolved the most. She developed the most as a character, I would say, from the time we meet her to the time she leaves the story. I think she changed more as a person than any of the other Shogun characters did. As someone who tends to favor character-driven series, I found that to be pretty engaging, I would say.
And then another one shortly after is the fifth shogun. I really enjoyed that as well. That's Tsunayoshi, I believe.
Mm.
Um,
Tsunayoshi.
she is, yeah, she is the one who, not really tragic. Actually, she is quite a tragic figure because there are a lot of things that happened during her era. It's a very prosperous. I think it's the Genroku era. Um, she is as flamboyant as all the activities going on around her, and she embraces that. She's actually the child of Gyokuei, who is Arimoto's or Akimoto's
Mm.
younger assistant. So he's one of those characters that we see basically the full stretch of his life, and how
Yeah.
he changes from a cat murderer to the sad father of unsuccessful
That cat
daughter
murder
being a
definitely
shogun.
that plays an impact later in the story. That cat murder, that's for sure.
Yeah, it does. It does.
Well, they're
There's
Buddhists.
so much, and there's so much with Tsunayoshi that happens as well, which I think is people might be more familiar with just in Japanese history, like the 47 Ronin, and she had all her unpopular edicts that she put out to uh,
Yeah, I
the
would
society
just
at
say
large.
with
She had so many like
Tsunayoshi,
effects.
she's not a sympathetic character for me, Tsunayoshi. To the extent that I don't know that she's necessarily supposed to be, but I don't find her to be a particularly I don't find her to be a particularly admirable character in any stretch or way, shape, or form.
No.
She's entertaining, but she's kind of the Emperor Nero of the story, if you will. Fans of Roman history will certainly know that reference.
Yeah, I mean, I say she's a tragic figure in the sense that I don't think she was particularly evil. There are other evil characters that I'm going to delve into shortly. She was extremely unpopular, but I think there was a self awareness with her. I don't know if there was just a major clash in who she was as a person and what it meant to be a ruler. And she feels like one of those characters who would have had a much better life if she wasn't thrust with this power, this control that she wasn't really capable or didn't want to have. And with all the ineffective decisions she made, yeah, it ended quite tragically for her as well. You know, she was infertile, and that was something that affected her. Well, like even comparing her and the third shogun, Iemitsu, um, yeah, those are two from the beginning of the series that stand out in my mind. If we're going after Yoshimune, um, one storyline that I think it carried through a couple of shogun, which I think is also up there as one of my favorite, is um, anything that involved Harusada. So she was the mother of who eventually of Ianari, who became the 11th shogun, and he was up until that point he was the first male shogun to return to the story. So this is post the red face pox as well. Um, and wow, she's one hell of a character. I don't know if you're gonna. Can you think of any characters who are as evil while still being as unassuming as her from first glance in her
I think we're
like
getting into like
machinations?
Game of Thrones Machiavellian type stuff, really, with her. She's a character who would have fit right in Song of Ice and Fire, don't you think? She totally fits that mold. She's
She
you know
would give
she's
Littlefinger a run for his money.
yeah, she's definitely in that mold. She's definitely in that Littlefinger vein. I unassuming, yes, but uh not to the point where I was ever really fooled by her. I would say, I think she kind of gives off that serial killer vibe right from the beginning. Really, for me, she's just, she's a piece of work, boy. I'll tell you, she's a piece of work. The other thing I was going to say about Arikoto is, I think, and I talked a little bit about the whole reincarnation question, which I don't think is ever intended to be taken literally. But I would say that with Teishoin, the character who pops up, Tenshoin, excuse me, the character who pops up at in the last 3 or 4 volumes, he sort of forms, I think, a bookend with Arikoto in that they're both. I think they're both. We talked about her being the most evil character. I think these are the two characters in the series who are probably the most unironically good. They tend to take a pretty broad spectrum, view of service over selfishness, pretty much religiously in the literal and figurative sense, more so religiously with Arikoto, but they both take this. They represent this ideal of public service and integrity that I think one is present basically at the beginning of the story and one at the end. But I think that there's a big intersection between those two. I think they sort of perform a similar role at two very different stages in the history that's being depicted.
Yeah, there's definitely a couple of characters that stand out. I think for that as well. One that I can think of is, I believe her name was Tanama Okitsugu. She was the one who was rising up in the ranks during Yoshimune's era and
Mm,
became the like servant for her daughters, and she was tasked with curing the red pox.
yeah,
Um, and like the great irony of her, even though she was so dedicated to it and dedicated to making the most of Yoshimune's daughters, was that she never got to see the completion of what she was
Right.
tasked to do. But there,
Yeah.
for all these cruel, diabolical, high drama characters that we see throughout the series, there is a fair share of genuine characters as well. That
Mm. Like, yeah, Abe
yep, yeah, yeah,
Masahiro is another one that springs to mind. Yeah, absolutely. And the last two shoguns too,
yeah.
I might add. I'm thinking Iemochi, particularly, who is not the last shogun
Oh
either in
yeah,
real
yeah.
life or in the series. But yeah, she's she's certainly kind to a fault. But I think she's she's a really an unironically good, kind, generous, caring, with ego, not at all ego driven person. Um, but I would say she lacked a certain. She was a smart person, smart woman, but lacked a certain cutting edge to it that would have made her more successful in her role, and maybe helped to forestall some of the things that happened after her departure from the story. That's my take on her.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned her, 'cause she to me is like the most endearing Shogun protagonist in that sense. She, I mean, her storyline, like so many of them, is quite tragic, but in a different way. She's inheriting this what feels like a failing. The Shogun at that point is failing and it's crumbling, and she's trying everything she can to maintain some semblance of power, while everything around her is crumbling. Um, you mentioned on the Chrysanthemum taboo, so that's when the imperial family is becoming more prominent, more powerful, and it's her marriage with Kazu, which at that point we're past. It's been so long since the Red Pox and a lot of the gender flipped, like the concept has been played around with, but many many years have gone past. But that is another time where it comes into play, and you have this idea of a woman pretending to be a man so that they can have this marriage, and they have, I feel like, what is one of the more genuine bonds later in the series, even though they are technically from opposing factions. And yeah, Iemochi's story was one where I was rooting for her, but already knowing that the time was ticking. Yeah, it's wrong Shogun at the wrong time as well, I think, for her.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that's fair. I just still think she was a little too nice for her own good, but there are worse faults to have than
Do you have
that, in a
any
way.
other thoughts and feelings? You can go into spoilers about how the series developed on a broader sense, and yeah, how it went
Yeah,
from the original first few volumes.
I mean, I do feel I liked the first few volumes and the last few volumes the best. There were that little interlude you referred to of the where they were searching for the cure for the red face pox. That was one part of the middle section that I really found to be very interesting, um, because it gets pretty deep into the weeds when it comes to the early steps being taken with vaccine development and stuff like that. It's very interesting. Um, but there are times where I felt the middle section of the story could become a little bit of a slog, if I'm honest. Because to her credit, she was trying to depict everything encyclopedically as if this were a historical chronicle, but not everyone in the history of Japan and the history of the shogunate is as engaging and as important as everyone else. That's just reality. There and there the middle parts of the story, I did feel there were times when it was like points that had already pretty much been conclusively made were being hammered a little more than they needed to be hammered. And just as a strictly as a work of entertainment, as a narrative fiction, I felt there were times when it did drag for me, if I'm honest. But I think it started and finished with its best material. I did find the last several volumes to be very good indeed. So I think honestly, one could make a case that the early section and the last section are the most important in any event. So if you're gonna have your top material, those are good places to have it. Other than that, I would say I think it's a very very clever, very very well conceived idea. It's a conceit. It sounds like a criticism, but it's not. It's a very clever conceit to make an observational story about Japanese history, about the kind of the things that have plagued Japan over its history, and about both the Japanese national character and about the human nature and about the genders. I think it's in a clever way that fantasy often does. It is able to comment on reality in ways that it probably wouldn't be able to get away with if it took a more literal approach. So I think it feels to me like she was like, how can I illustrate these points I'm trying to make? And I think coming up with this idea that she did, relatively straightforward when you think about it. This whole red face pox MacGuffin, but it's a quite an interesting and quite it's extremely useful plot device, and it's used in a very interesting way. And to watch the way that what happens in the story kind of wobbles away from the real historical timeline and then kind of comes back and goes away again, and what events take it closer to reality and what events push it farther away. It is kind of an interesting kind of a thought experiment to watch that play out. And I was never less than engaged intellectually, but there were times where I was less engaged emotionally with the story, particularly in the middle section. That would be my overall overarching comment.
Off the back of that, then I'm going to circle. Back to the ending, which I touched upon briefly about. When did you think that maybe this was becoming less of a fantasy alternative story depiction and more of straightforward history? For me, I was kind of, you know, we have this reveal, which I think of it kind of as a final twist in the very final page, which ends on what could be a takeaway for the series that isn't one that I thought of before then, which is you see the assistant of the final shogun on the boat because the country has opened up now. The Tokugawa Shogunate has fallen, and you see all the implications of the fallout from that, everything that comes from there. And you see this interaction with the young girl who's going to America. By this point in the series as well, the character it's mentioned that they burn all evidence that the shogun were women because if I'm remembering correctly, when the foreigners came into the storyline more later on, they didn't want to show that they had that aspect of their society, and they put on this male presenting front in that sense. So you have this little girl that we see in the boat at the very final scene who wants to make more of her life and is going to America to do all these things. And very final note that this assistant said he served the shogun, and for so many years the shogun were women. Now, I took that as Fumi Yoshinaga saying, "What if they were all women?" It becomes less of like just a thought exercise and something that you could actually consider as a reality if this is how things did play out. And if they did play it like this, would it be much different in the end, having women in charge than having men? That was definitely one thing that, from that final page, stuck with me for a long time and was a different note that I thought the series was going to end on than it actually did. I don't know. Did you pick up on that? The intention behind that? Did you think anything more of
Um,
that?
yeah, I got to be honest. I gotta loop back to the comment you made about the speech at the end of Yugami-kun. It kind of that scene played the similar way to me. It felt a little bit inauthentic. I felt like all the things that she, it seemed to me that she was trying to say I felt to me like what she said more elegantly over the course of 19 volumes, she tried to say in a rather clumsy way in, 5 panels. I didn't need to have, I didn't need to be spoon fed that message because I felt like the whole series was about telling that story without having to break it down in rather straightforward terms like that. So I don't think it was inconsistent with the message of the story, but I feel like it was an inelegant way of summarizing what the intent of the story was. Again, it's not remotely important to me in the larger context. It doesn't really affect my overall take on the series. I personally didn't feel like it was it didn't feel like a good elegiac way of ending it for me. It felt a little bit too neat and tidy, if that makes any sense. I do, however, think the more interesting question for me is, we have this whole story where women come to power because they have to. And as he said, ironically, Kasuga is a dead set against it. She's a capital C conservative. She does not want women to be in power because women are not supposed to be in power. And it's the men around her who are arguing that, maybe this is the only way forward. And we see women rise to the corridors of power initially because they have to, and eventually we get to the point where people forget that there was ever a time where women weren't the ones holding the reins of power, and it's men who are discriminated against and thought to be unfit for that kind of thing, and all that. And yet, and among these women, just as among the men who preceded and followed them, some of them are great at it, some of them suck at it, and most of them are somewhere in the middle. And the world isn't that different with women running it than it is with men running it, honestly, which I think is a very kind of an interesting spin. But why is it that women, as we see, once the red face pox is eradicated, um, uh, in a relatively short period of time, it kind of goes back to status quo. And even though there are a couple of female shoguns late in the story, the overarching attitude at that point is, well, geez, why are women, as shoguns? I mean, gosh, I mean, they're that's not their role. They shouldn't be doing that. So we've kind of almost come full circle. And even though women had this taste of power for a long period of time, they seem like they're relatively, it goes back to the way things were in relatively easily. And I'm very interested that it happens that way. And I never feel like the author is telling us that's the way it should be, but I do think it's very interesting that that is the way it kind of is. Um, so I thought that was interesting. That's my take on the ending. Really, is that I find it fascinating that she's making a very eloquent case over the course of 19 volumes that that as Abe Masahiro is the one who's arguing, and later the Shogun Iemochi takes this view too, that it should be based on not on gender, but not based on class or birth. It should be based on skill. It should be based on talent. But in the end, once the pox is eliminated, it becomes mostly the status quo of men running the show again, and I find that to be quite fascinating.
I think my take on what Fumi Yoshinaga was doing with that is maybe just showing how fragile having that power is. And even though we established over 100 years what feels like the norm for women being in that position, there maybe still is that inherent sexism amongst men and women towards what they think who should be presented as someone in a position of power. And yeah, that is an interesting thing to consider. I agree. I think unless you've got anything else, Enzo, that I think covers what we can talk about as highlights in the spoiler discussion.
That's good. I'm good.
Um, this is I think this is a difficult series to recommend because, like I've mentioned, it is quite different in its approach to how it handles the story and the sheer scope of it. I'll start with my recommendation. My recommendation is something that has basically no resemblance when you consider the plot or the tone of it, and that's going to be JoJo's Bizarre Adventure by Hirohiko Araki. the reason why I pick that is it has this the similar main similarity it has is this grandness of the overarching narrative being integral to the series through the different generations of one family and how the consequences of who came before and what generation and how that bleeds into the decision and what's available for any other characters that come after. I think Joseph's Bizarre Adventure, that's 100 over 130 volumes now across 9 parts. That is one in the series that is as epic as it comes to telling that sort of story. Ooku, I would say, goes in even more detail in a shorter amount of time, but yeah, I from reading Ooku, I want as many recommendations as possible that tackle the story with that epic overarching approach. And yeah, if anyone else has any, please throw them my way. I feel like JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, despite how different it is, kind of tackles it in its own bizarre way, I would say. Enzo, I'm interested to hear yours. What's your recommendation?
Yeah, my recommendation is it one that came to me pretty quickly actually. It's Hyogemono by Yamada Yoshihiro. And it has some obvious differences from Oku in that it tells its story over the course of decades instead of centuries, and it because of that it has it's able to tell a story through the there is one character who sort of serves as the spine of the whole story. It takes him from being a young man to an old man, and it involves the Tokugawa in a very prominent way. But it's really more about that Sengoku period and when we had the great warlords of Japan and Tokugawa first came into the scene and Hideyoshi. But more than anything, it's I think it's a reflection on Japanese society, the peculiarities of the Japanese national character, and I say peculiarities in the sense that every national character has peculiarities, Japanese no less than any other. And this is a series that kind of reflects on those. And it does take this approach of how would history be different if something, if you stepped on the butterfly wing right here, how would the rest of history be different? And it's a less alternative timeline than what we see in Oku, but it is still an alternative timeline with some specifics that are very, very different. Um, and and eventually wind up, as Oku does, coming more or less back to the same place in the end. And I think it's to me, I like it even better than Oku. I think it's really a spectacularly inventive and interesting series, reflecting probably my prejudices. It's more character driven than plot driven, which may be the reason that I prefer it. But it does have a great overarching plot, and it also has a very interesting take on the very uniquely Japanese intersection between militarism and the world of the estate, the tea ceremony, and the samurai, and this great obsession with things artistic clashing with this very militaristic culture of ritual suicide and and conquest. And it's a fascinating. It really, the subtext of it, even literally, is it's even described and self-described as the warrior and the estate, and the main character is both. And I think it's a really fascinating look at a chunk of Japanese history that's part of the arc of Oku. Actually, the beginning part of it overlaps it, and just to really, I think if you like one, I think there's a good chance you like the other. So that would be my recommendation, Hyogemono. It got a 39 episode anime, which is very good, and but the manga is 25 volumes, and the anime probably covers maybe half to 60% of it, I would say.
Okay, I'm gonna let you kick this one off, Enzo. Take it away. Tell me, what is the score for Oku, The Inner Chambers, from you? And your final thoughts as well.
My final thoughts are I would be very interested in seeing this get a really good anime. I would love to see it get a really good anime. I'm surprised it got any at all, though. So, it is what it is. Uh, I appreciate its scope, I appreciate its ambition. I think it's full of interesting ideas. Uh, I think there are times when its ambition maybe outstrips its reach just a little bit. And so I think there are times when I feel a bit of detach because of that. But on balance, I'm going to give it 82. I think it's a very good series. There are, like I said, I mean, something of a similar vein. I would, rank Hyogemono a little bit higher, but other series I might go a little bit higher. But still, as you said yourself, there aren't a lot of series that attempt to tell a story on the scale that this one does. So you're not going to find a lot of substitutes for it. And I think for that reason alone, it's certainly a highly worthwhile. It's not a series that probably stylistically matches up with me perfectly, but I definitely appreciate it. I definitely appreciate the intelligence of it. I appreciate the wit. I think there are times when it's actually very funny, which you don't really get a lot of that from what we saw in the anime, but there are times where it's quite funny, and I think that's very endearing, and I think it's very good. So not a series that I abjectly loved, and not a series that I don't see some things that didn't totally click with me, but still very very good, and one I give a score of 82.
Fair. That's a very good score. Yeah, I could see that this maybe wasn't going to be the series that would resonate with you as much as it did with me, only because of how it wasn't super character driven. But yeah, um, nice. For me, it is one of my favorites of all time. There's so few series like it which give me that same feeling of it being so grand in scope while intimate in detail. If you go with all the different storylines and characters and arcs, and if you try and even think about the series in its totality, there are so many things that just escape you. I give it a 99, and it's one of my all time favorites. And thank you again, Enzo, for reading it after all these years of me badgering about the series and how much I loved it.
No problem. I enjoyed it.
And yeah, thank you everyone for listening. I hope you enjoyed, and stick around for next time where we'll be discussing more series. Bye bye.
Bye bye.